Welcome to the deep dive. If you've been feeling maybe a bit overwhelmed by the sheer density of the 2025 Canadian federal budget, well, you're in the right place.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
Definitely. Our mission today is really to cut through the line items and, extract the strategic core of this plan. The government's framed it around three pillars: build, protect, and empower.
Right, and it's a massive document, but we've tried to distill the key insights, pulling directly from the Budget 2025.pdf excerpts. What's really striking, I think, is the sheer audacity of the growth target they're setting.
And the foundation they claim they're building on, right?
Exactly. They kick things off with this strong pitch about Canada's existing global competitive advantage.
Yeah, they talk about being ranked #1 globally for the most educated workforce, that's OECD data, and #2 in FDI confidence, according to Carney's 2025 index. So they're trying to sell stability and talent up front.
And that stability piece is crucial. They mentioned the AAA credit rating boasts the lowest deficit to GDP ratio in the G7. And they're leveraging that fiscal standing to launch what's basically a 5-year capital campaign. The stated goal, to catalyze an extraordinary $500 billion in new private investment.
That's $500 billion. Wow, that's the big number the entire budget seems to hinge on.
It really is.
And if they actually manage to, crowd in that much private capital, the projection is pretty ambitious. Real GDP per capita rising by $1,400 per year by 2030. That's a fundamental transformation they're promising.
It absolutely is. But look, to raise that kind of money and promise that kind of growth, you need to sort of change the wiring of the economy. And this is where that first pillar build comes in. It's entirely focused on massive capital formation.
Okay, let's unpack this financial pivot then. The budget commits to $280 billion in accrual basis capital investments over 5 years. But they also mentioned $450 billion on a cash basis. Why are we seeing two different numbers here? What does that mean for you listening?
Right. That difference is actually the key signal of their new strategic approach. The $280 billion, that's the accrual figure, reflects how assets are accounted for over their lifetime, sort of spread out.
Okay.
The larger $450 billion cash basis figure, that represents the actual money flowing out the door in the short term. This distinction is part of their new capital budgeting framework, which interestingly has been endorsed by the IMF.
So it's not just paying for daily operations. They're setting aside a specific chunk of cash now for long-term productive assets, kind of like a homeowner taking out a separate mortgage for a big reno instead of paying for it all out of their monthly spending.
Precisely. That's a great analogy. And by doing this, they project enabling over $1 trillion in total investments if they hit that private sector support target.
Right, the $500 billion from the private side.
Yeah. And that requires a fundamental shift in how businesses decide to invest in Canada, which leads us right to the productivity superdeduction.
Okay, that sounds a bit complex, maybe. Why is this the centerpiece of their business competitiveness strategy?
Well, it's highly targeted. This superdeduction is basically a form of accelerated capital depreciation. It lets businesses write off the cost of new equipment or machinery faster than they normally could.
Okay, so faster write-offs.
Exactly. And the explicit policy goal isn't just to be competitive, but to be the most tax-competitive jurisdiction in the G7 for new business investment. They want the lowest marginal effective tax rate, or EETR.
The AETR. So that's kind of the global benchmark for where companies decide to put their money. They're trying to make Canada the cheapest place, tax-wise, for a company to buy, say, a new factory or some fancy robotics.
That's the mechanism, yeah. And they're also fixing programs that were already there but maybe got bogged down in bureaucracy. Like they're reforming the scientific research and experimental development, SR&ED tax incentives. The goal is to simplify the administration.
Oh, that's a huge point. I know from looking at the source material, the SR&E program was often criticized, wasn't it? For complex, sometimes subjective auditing, which scared off smaller companies.
Exactly. So simplifying that process could be just as important as the deduction itself for actually boosting R&D.
Makes sense.
And, well, R&D today often means AI, right? They've earmarked $925.6 million over 5 years, specifically to build large-scale sovereign public AI infrastructure and support a sovereign Canadian cloud.
Why is that word sovereign so key here? Is this about data security, or is it more like an intellectual property retention move?
It's both, really, but I'd say primarily IP retention. By building domestic, large-scale public AI compute capacity, they want to ensure that Canadian innovations, the models, the data, the talent, stay within the national ecosystem.
Instead of relying solely on like the big foreign-owned cloud providers.
Precisely. It's almost a defense strategy for future economic growth. And don't forget the parallel push into quantum tech, $334.3 million through the Defense Industrial Strategy. It's that clear dual-use focus again. Tech for defense and tech for the economy.
Okay, but all these incentives in compute power, they only really work if they translate into massive physical projects on the ground, right?
Absolutely. And they seem to have recognized that the federal permitting process can be, well, glacial. So they've set up a new Major Projects Office, MPO. This office is supposed to be dedicated to fast-tracking an initial $60 billion in capital investments.
Okay, $60 billion fast-tracked. And here's where the vision gets really specific, isn't it? The scale of some of these projects is just astounding.
It really is.
We're talking about fast-tracking LNG Canada Phase 2 doubling capacity, projected to run with 35% lower emissions than the world's best. That's a huge global statement.
And in energy innovation, they're really touting the Darlington New nuclear project. That's a $2 billion injection via the Canada Growth Fund, aiming to make Canada the first G7 country with an operational small modular reactor, an SMR.
An operational SMR that's putting down a marker, first in the G7.
Definitely aiming for a leadership position there. Plus, connecting the far north with the Arctic Economic and Security Corridor, that's dual-use land and port infrastructure for northern economic development, but also clearly for defense needs.
Right, but all this new industrial capacity, it needs access to global markets. How are they planning to actually move all this stuff?
Through a big expansion of their trade diversification strategy. The explicit goal is ambitious: double overseas exports over a decade. That translates to finding another $300 billion in trade volume.
Wow, $300 billion more. How?
Well, they're putting money into the Trade Diversification Corridors Fund. The idea is to invest specifically in new ports, airports, and railway infrastructure to handle that increased flow.
Okay, so if the build pillar is this long-term $500 billion capital gamble, the next pillar, Empower, seems to shift gears completely. It's addressing the immediate financial pain points, right? Affordability, housing, things affecting everyday Canadians right now.
Exactly. This is the part of the budget that will likely be most immediately visible to the public. And probably the most politically charged measure is the cancellation of the consumer carbon price, the fuel charge.
Right, and they're explicitly winding down the associated rebate mechanisms, too.
Yes. And the expected result for consumers is pretty stark. Gasoline prices dropping by up to 18 cents per liter in most provinces and territories starting April 2025.
That's immediate high-impact relief, even if it means those quarterly rebate checks go away.
It is. And coupled with that is tax relief, including the previously announced middle-class tax cut. But, I found the introduction of the temporary top-up tax credit particularly interesting.
Why is that? Why is that credit needed?
Well, it seems like a mechanism to handle an unintended political consequence. When you cut the lowest marginal tax rate, it can sometimes counterintuitively negatively impact people who rely heavily on non-refundable credits.
Like people with big tuition credits or donations or maybe high medical expenses.
Exactly. So this temporary top-up tax credit is designed surgically, really, to make sure those individuals, often middle-income earners with specific financial burdens, don't actually see their taxes go up because of the system change. It's like tax protection.
Huh. That's a fascinating detail, almost an admission that tax reform can sometimes hurt the very people it intends to help. Okay, moving into social support. They're making the National School Food Program permanent.
That's a major commitment. They project it'll serve up to 400,000 children, saving participating families maybe $800 a year, they estimate.
Second.
And they also noted tweaks to the Canada Disability Benefit. Specifically, a one-time supplemental payment of $150 to help offset the costs of getting the required disability tax credit DTC certificate.
So tackling an administrative hurdle there, making it easier to actually access the benefit.
Precisely. Addressing a known barrier.
Okay, let's turn to housing. Central to Empower, they're launching Build Canada Homes, a whole new federal agency. What's its focus?
It's specifically focused on accelerating the supply of non-market housing. But the efficiency targets they're talking about are what really jumped out at me in the housing section.
How so?
They're seriously championing advanced construction methods. Prefabrication, modular building. They claim this could cut building timelines by up to 50%.
50%?
Half the time.
And reduce costs by as much as 20%.
Wow. A 50% time cut. I mean, if a big project that normally takes 2 years could genuinely be done in one, that fundamentally changes the housing supply crisis equation, doesn't it?
It really does.
But are those targets actually achievable at scale?
Look, they're aggressive, no doubt.
Mm.
But the technology itself exists. The real challenge is scaling up the supply chain for these methods, which is presumably what the new agency, Build Canada Homes, is supposed to help facilitate.
Right. Facilitation.
And they've also tweaked the financing side. They're increasing the Canada Mortgage Bond annual issuance limit from $60 billion up to $80 billion. But here's the kicker. That entire $20 billion increase is ring-fenced exclusively for multi-unit housing.
So a direct incentive to fund apartments and density, not just single-family homes.
Exactly. A powerful signal to the market. Okay, we also have to touch on the shift in immigration strategy. They're talking about restoring sustainability. This has been, well, a pretty hot topic recently.
Indeed. And the strategy signals a clear tightening, no question. The 2026-2028 Immigration Levels Plan aims to stabilize permanent resident admissions at less than 1% of the Canadian population beyond 2027.
Stabilizing PRs. Okay.
But maybe more dramatically, they're aiming to reduce the total number of temporary residents from a peak of 7.6% of the population in 2024 down to less than 5% by the end of 2027.
That's a significant, deliberate reduction in the temporary resident population. Quite a shift.
It is, though they are softening it slightly with a one-time measure to fast-track about 33,000 work permit holders to permanent residency. So it seems like a tightening strategy, but with a focus on integrating those already here and contributing.
Right. Okay, which brings us to our final pillar, protect. This covers security and enforcement, but also ties into government efficiency, or as they put it, spending less.
Yeah, the two seem linked here.
Right.
On the security front, it's pretty straightforward. A big hiring surge. 1,000 new Canada Border Services Agency officers and 1,000 new RCMP personnel.
So boots on the ground resources, targeting what specifically?
Organized crime, gun and drug trafficking, cross-border money laundering networks, the usual suspects, but with more manpower.
Got it.
Financial security is also a focus. They're launching a dedicated national anti-fraud strategy, apparently with a specific eye on protecting vulnerable groups like seniors and newcomers. Plus, tightening the review process for foreign bank investment for national security risks, another nod to protecting sovereign interests.
Okay, now let's talk money specifically. Saving money. The Comprehensive Expenditure Review, CER. This seems like the operational engine that's supposed to help fund the whole build agenda, right?
That appears to be the plan. They're targeting $60 billion in total savings and revenues over 5 years. That's a lot of finding efficiencies.
$60 billion. How on earth do they plan to realize that massive amount of savings?
Well, a large chunk seems to come from actually shrinking the workforce.
Mm.
They're aiming to reduce the size of the federal public service by about 16,000 full-time equivalents. That's roughly 4.5% of the workforce by 2028-29.
16,000 positions.
Yeah. They stress it'll be managed partly through attrition,
Mm.
so not replacing staff who leaves naturally, and also through a voluntary early retirement incentive ERI program.
Okay, voluntary measures and attrition. Still, cutting 16,000 jobs, even voluntarily, while trying to oversee potentially $1 trillion in total investment and launch complex new programs like Build Canada Homes, doesn't that create a massive operational tension?
It absolutely does.
Can the bureaucracy really shrink effectively enough to attract all that private capital, or will things just get clogged up?
That, I think, is the central high-risk trade-off of this entire budget. They're trying to fund future productivity growth by maximizing current government efficiency, squeezing the system, basically.
And part of that efficiency push seems to be cutting red tape and getting rid of taxes deemed inefficient or maybe just too complex.
Exactly. I noticed 2 highly visible tax eliminations. The underused housing tax is gone, starting in 2025.
Okay, that was controversial.
And they're also ending the luxury tax on aircraft and vessels. Now, these might be relatively small in terms of revenue, but they send a big signal, especially to high-value capital.
Right, a signal about being open for business, simplifying things.
Absolutely. It's about changing the perceived environment. And for businesses more broadly, they're starting consultations to restrict the use of non-compete agreements in federally regulated sectors.
Ah, interesting. That's aimed at boosting labor mobility and maybe entrepreneurship, making it easier for people to switch jobs or start their own thing.
That seems to be the logic. And one final detail on the efficiency integrity front, this new reverse charge mechanism to combat GSTHS carousel fraud. They're starting with the telecom sector.
Okay, hang on. For you listening, what exactly is carousel fraud?
That sounds elaborate. Yeah, in simple terms, carousel fraud is basically when a chain of businesses colludes to falsely claim input tax credits, GST, HST refunds on goods that maybe don't actually exist or have been moved out of the country or just shuffled around. They generate cash refunds from the government fraudulently.
So how does a reverse charge stop that?
It shifts the responsibility. Instead of the seller charging and collecting the GST, HST, the recipient of the goods or services becomes responsible for self-assessing and remitting the tax in certain high-risk transactions. It breaks the chain where the fraudulent refund claims can happen.
Got it. Highly technical, but sounds like an important integrity measure.
Definitely.
So when we try to synthesize all this for you, the listener, it really feels like there are two very different parallel stories running through this budget, doesn't it?
I think so. You've got this massive long-term capital formation push under the AI, the SMRs, the ports, the big infrastructure plays.
Right, the huge bets on the future.
And running right alongside it, you have these immediate affordability fixes and this really quite radical government belt-tightening campaign under Empower and the CER.
Short-term relief and long-term structural change happening at the same time.
Precisely. And I think the core takeaway, or maybe the intended narrative, is this shift towards treating infrastructure and major projects as long-term assets, guided by that new capital budgeting framework we talked about.
Moving spending away from just operational overhead and towards productive capacity.
Yes. And again, that approach has the IMS endorsement, which suggests some institutional buy-in for this kind of structural change in budgeting.
Okay, so here's maybe the final knowledge nugget for you to take away. The success of this entire ambitious plan seems staked on actually crowding in that $500 billion in private investment.
Absolutely critical.
They're making all these sweeping tax changes, streamlining projects, and cutting 16,000 public service jobs, all seemingly to signal that Canada is wide open for massive, efficient investment.
But here's the central challenge, the big question mark, especially when you consider things like weakening global growth predictions, maybe due to trade tensions.
Right.
Can the government actually manage to shrink its operational footprint, cutting thousands of jobs, trying to streamline services effectively enough to attract that unprecedented level of private capital? Or do the simultaneous cuts create internal bottlenecks and inefficiencies that actually hamstring the very build ambition they're trying to fund?
That really raises an important question for you, the listener, doesn't it? If the bureaucracy gets smaller and theoretically leaner, will that really translate into the speed and certainty that $500 billion in private capital demands? Or will it just slow things down?
Yeah, that's the tension.
It really is the tension right at the heart of the 2025 Canadian budget. It's a massive test of whether government efficiency can truly catalyze that level of private sector growth.
Something to definitely mull over as you watch these investments and these cuts roll out over the coming years.
Absolutely. Well, that's it for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.